The altar was a cascade of white roses, trembling in the warm Virginia breeze. But the air felt like it could shatter. Emily, barely 12, stood frozen in her pale blue dress, her flower crown lopsided, her cheeks stinging red from the slap that had silenced the crowd. Her stepfather, Richard, the groom, loomed over her, his face a mask of rage that no one, not the guests, not the bride, not even God could have seen coming. It was supposed to be a perfect day. The rolling hills of Charlottesville stretched out under a June sky, the kind of blue that promised forever. Richard, a respected lawyer with a smile that could charm a jury, was marrying Claire, Emily's mother, a woman whose quiet strength had carried her through years of single motherhood. The guests' friends, family, colleagues had gathered under a sprawling oak, their laughter and clinking glasses filling the air until Emily, clutching her basket of petals, stepped forward to speak. She'd practiced her words for weeks, a sweet tribute to her mother's new beginning. But something she said, something small and innocent about her late father, had flipped a switch in Richard. His hand flew, and the crack of it against her skin stopped time. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the joy from the day. Claire's hands flew to her mouth, her white gown trembling as she reached for Emily. But Richard's voice cut through first. "You don't get to mention him today." He spat, his words venomous, aimed at a child who only wanted to honor her mother. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others frozen in disbelief. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of the moment pressed down, heavy as the summer heat. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a figure stirred. Julian, Richard's younger brother, stood up, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing. He was the family's black sheep, the openly gay artist who'd left their conservative hometown years ago to chase a life unapologetically his own. He'd come back for the wedding, against his better judgment, because Richard had begged him, claiming he'd changed. Julian hadn't believed it, but he'd hoped. Now, as he strode toward the microphone at the altar, his tailored suit catching the sunlight, he knew hope had been a mistake. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian's voice was steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. "This ends now." He turned to Richard, his brother, the man who'd once been his hero. "You don't get to hurt her. Not today. Not ever." The crowd held its breath, and Emily's wide eyes found Julian's, a spark of trust flickering through her fear. Claire, torn between her daughter and the man she thought she loved, stood paralyzed, her heart breaking in real time. Julian's words weren't just for Emily. They were for himself, for the boy he'd been, silenced by Richard's cruelty years ago. Growing up in their small Virginia town, Julian had endured his brother's taunts, the whispered slurs, the constant pressure to be someone he wasn't. Richard, the golden son, had always been the one their parents propped up, while Julian was told to hide, to shrink, to disappear. He'd left at 18, building a life in New York, where he found love, art, and a community that embraced him. But the scars of his childhood lingered, and seeing Richard raise his hand to Emily ripped them open. The wedding was unraveling, and Julian was at the center of it. He didn't care. He'd spent too long staying quiet. And now, with the microphone in his hand, he was done. "You think you can control everyone," he said, his voice rising. not with anger, but with a clarity that made the guests lean forward. You think you can bully your way into being the man you pretend to be. But I see you. Richard. I've always seen you. Claire's eyes darted between her fiancé and her daughter, who was now clinging to her side. The truth was dawning on her. Heavy and undeniable. Richard's charm. His promises. His polished exterior, they were a facade. She'd ignored the red flags, the way he'd dismiss Emily's feelings, the subtle control he exerted over their lives. She'd convinced herself it was love. But now, with Julian's words ringing in her ears, she saw it for what it was. Richard's face twisted, his composure cracking. You don't get to ruin this, he hissed at Julian, stepping forward. But Julian didn't flinch. He'd faced worse than his brother's temper. He'd faced a world that told him he didn't belong. And he'd survived. He wasn't backing down now. Ruin this. Julian laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. You did that when you raised your hand to a child. He turned to the crowd, his voice softening but no less powerful. This isn't love. This isn't family. This is control. And it stops here. Emily's small hand slipped into Claire's, and something shifted in the bride's eyes. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. Richard, she said, her words barely above a whisper. This is over. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some shocked, others nodding in quiet agreement. Richard's face paled, his hands clenching, but he had no words. For the first time, he was powerless. Julian knelt beside Emily, brushing a tear from her cheek. You're braver than he'll ever be, he whispered. She nodded, her lips trembling into a small smile. The wedding was in pieces. But in that moment, something new was being built, a bond. A truth. A family that didn't need to hide. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden. The guests began to disperse, some whispering about Richard's outburst, others praising Julian's courage. Claire held Emily close, her decision made, her heart heavy but free. Julian stood by them, the brother who'd come to play a role and ended up rewriting the story. But this was only the beginning. Richard wasn't the kind of man to let go easily, and the fallout of this day would ripple through their lives. Julian knew it. Claire felt it. And Emily, young as she was, sensed it too. The fight for their freedom, their truth, was far from over. The days after the wedding were a storm of silence and chaos. Claire moved Emily and herself into a small apartment in downtown Charlottesville, a temporary refuge from the life she'd almost committed to. The white gown hung in a closet, untouched, a ghost of what might have been. Emily clung to her mother, her usual chatter replaced by quiet glances, as if she feared saying the wrong thing again. Claire's heart ached every time she saw the faint bruise on her daughter's cheek, a reminder of the moment she'd failed to protect her. Julian stayed close, renting a room at a nearby inn. He'd planned to return to New York right after the wedding, but something kept him tethered to Virginia. Maybe it was Emily's small, trusting smile, or Claire's haunted eyes, or the nagging sense that Richard wasn't done with them. Julian knew his brother too well. Richard didn't lose gracefully. He'd built his life on control, and losing Claire and Emily in front of everyone was a wound to his pride he wouldn't let heal. Claire spent her nights replaying the wedding, dissecting every moment she'd missed. Richard's charm had blinded her. He'd been attentive, generous, the kind of man who opened doors and paid for dinners. But there were signs his sharp tone when Emily talked about her father. The way he'd redirect conversations to himself. The subtle pressure to move faster than she wanted. She'd ignored them, desperate for stability, for a partner after years alone. Now, she felt like a fool. Julian, meanwhile, was wrestling with his own ghosts. He'd spent years running from his family, from the suffocating expectations of their small town. Coming out at 17 had been a liberation, but it came at a cost. His parents had called it a phase, a sin, a choice. Richard had been worse, mocking him in front of their friends, calling him names that cut deeper than Julian ever admitted. Leaving for New York had saved him. But standing up to Richard at the wedding had awakened something, a need to confront the past he'd buried. One evening, Julian took Claire and Emily to a diner on the edge of town. A place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like home. Emily picked at her fries, her eyes darting to Julian. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly, her voice small but direct. "Why did you stand up for me?" Julian set down his mug, his throat tight. "Because I know what it's like to feel like you don't matter," he said. "And you do, Emily. You matter more than anything." Her eyes welled up, and she slid closer to him, resting her head against his arm. Claire watched, her own eyes misty, realizing Julian had given her daughter something she hadn't, someone who saw her, truly saw her. But the calm was short-lived. Richard began calling, leaving voicemails that started apologetic and turned sharp. "You can't just walk away, Claire," he said in one, his voice low and controlled. "We had a deal. You owe me." Claire deleted them, but each one left her colder. Then came the texts to her, to mutual friends, even to Emily's school, painting himself as the victim. The jilted groom betrayed by an ungrateful fiancé and her troubled daughter. The rumors spread, a slow poison seeping through their community. Julian saw the toll it was taking. He suggested they fight back. Go public. Tell the truth about what happened. Claire hesitated. She wasn't ready to air their pain, to let the world judge her choices. But Emily, surprisingly, was the one who pushed. "He hurt me," she said one night, her voice fierce. "I don't want him to hurt anyone else." Claire looked at her daughter, seeing a strength she hadn't noticed before, and nodded. They decided to share their story, starting small. Julian helped Claire draft a post for a local online forum, describing the wedding, the slap, and Richard's true character. He didn't sugarcoat it, but he kept it measured, focusing on Emily's bravery and Claire's resolve. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in support from strangers, stories from others who'd known Richard's darker side, even apologies from wedding guests who'd stayed silent. But there were also detractors, friends of Richard's who called Claire a liar, who said Julian was stirring trouble because of his lifestyle. The backlash stung, but it also lit a fire. Julian reached out to a friend in New York, a journalist who covered human interest stories. She agreed to meet them, intrigued by the drama and the deeper thread of resilience. The interview was set for the following week, a chance to take their story beyond their small town. Claire was nervous, but Julian coached her, reminding her that truth was their weapon. As they prepared, Richard's shadow loomed larger. He showed up at Claire's workplace, a law firm where she worked as a paralegal, demanding to talk. She refused, but he lingered in the parking lot, watching. Julian started driving them everywhere, his eyes scanning for Richard's car. The tension was suffocating, but it also brought them closer. Julian taught Emily to sketch, filling her afternoons with color and laughter. Claire found herself opening up to him, sharing fears she'd never voiced. They were becoming a family, not by blood, but by choice. The night before the interview, Julian sat with Claire on the apartment's tiny balcony, the stars bright above. "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if this makes it worse?" Julian took her hand, his grip steady. "It might," he said honestly. "But hiding doesn't make it better. You're stronger than you know, Claire. And you're not alone." She squeezed his hand, grateful for the brother she'd never expected to find. But Richard wasn't done. He was watching, waiting, and planning. The interview would be a spark, and he intended to turn it into a fire one that would burn them all. The journalist's name was Mara, a sharp-eyed woman with a knack for cutting through noise to find the heart of a story. She met Claire, Emily, and Julian at a quiet coffee shop in Richmond, away from prying eyes in Charlottesville. The place smelled of espresso and fresh pastries, but the air between them crackled with purpose. Mara listened as Claire recounted the wedding, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of betrayal. Emily, sitting close to Julian, added small details: how she'd felt the sting of Richard's hand, how Julian's voice at the microphone had made her feel safe. Julian spoke last, his words measured but raw, tying his own past to Emily's present, weaving a narrative of standing up to those who wield power to hurt. Mara's recorder captured every word, but it was her questions that cut deepest. "Why now?" she asked Claire. "What made you decide to speak out?" Claire paused, her eyes on Emily, who was sketching in a notebook Julian had given her. "Because my daughter deserves a world where she's not afraid," she said finally. "And I want her to know I'll fight for her." Mara nodded, her pen moving quickly. "The story," she said, "could run in a national outlet, maybe even get picked up by bigger platforms." It was a chance to expose Richard, but also to shine a light on resilience, on chosen family, on the courage to rebuild. The interview left them hopeful but exposed. Driving back to Charlottesville, Julian noticed a black SUV trailing them, too close for coincidence. He didn't mention it to Claire or Emily, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. Richard was out there, and Julian's instincts screamed that he was planning something. He'd always been strategic, the kind of man who played chess with people's lives. Julian had seen it growing up: Richard manipulating their parents, their friends, even their church to keep his image pristine. Now, with his reputation at stake, he'd be desperate. Back at the apartment, Claire noticed Julian's unease. "What's wrong?" she asked after Emily went to bed. He hesitated, then told her about the SUV. Claire's face paled, but she didn't crumble. "We need to be ready," she said. "He's not going to stop." They agreed to install a security camera and change their routines, avoiding predictable patterns. Julian also reached out to a lawyer friend in New York, asking about restraining orders and defamation laws. They were arming themselves, not with weapons, but with knowledge and resolve. The story broke a week later, published in an online magazine with a wide reach. Mara had crafted it with care, balancing the drama of the wedding with the deeper human truths: Emily's bravery, Claire's awakening, Julian's defiance. The response was electric. Comments flooded in. Most supportive, some vicious. Strangers shared their own stories of surviving controlling partners or abusive family members. A local LGBTQ+ group reached out to Julian, offering support and inviting him to speak at an event. But there were also threats. Anonymous messages calling Claire a liar, Julian a troublemaker, even targeting Emily. The ugliness was a reminder of why they'd hesitated to go public. Richard's response came swiftly. He posted a lengthy statement on social media, painting himself as the victim of a vindictive ex and her unstable brother-in-law. He claimed Emily had provoked him, that Julian had always been jealous, that Claire was manipulated by both. He even hinted at legal action, calling the article slander. His followers, mostly colleagues and old friends, rallied behind him, amplifying his narrative. Claire's phone buzzed with notifications, each one a jab at her resolve. Julian, though, saw through the noise. He's scared, he told Claire. This is what he does when he's cornered: lash out, deflect, control the story. He suggested they keep pushing, not just for themselves, but for others who might be trapped in similar dynamics. Claire agreed, but her focus was Emily. The girl was stronger than before, laughing more, sketching vibrant scenes of gardens and families. But she still flinched at loud noises, and Claire caught her checking the locks at night. They decided to host a small gathering at the apartment, a way to reclaim their space and build community. Julian invited a few trusted friends from New York, including his partner, Leo, a soft-spoken chef with a warm laugh. Leo's presence was a balm, especially for Emily, who took to him instantly, helping him bake cookies while Julian and Claire planned their next steps. The gathering was small but powerful. Neighbors, a co-worker of Claire's, a teacher who'd supported Emily. They shared stories, laughed, and for a few hours, felt like they could breathe. But Richard was watching. He'd hired a private investigator, a detail Julian's lawyer friend uncovered through a contact. The investigator had been digging into Claire's past, Julian's life in New York, even Emily's school records. It was a violation, but it wasn't illegal, not yet. Julian felt the walls closing in, but he also felt a fire growing. He'd spent too long running from his brother's shadow. Now, he was ready to fight, not just for himself, but for the family he'd found. As the gathering ended, Julian stood at the apartment window, looking out at the quiet street. Leo joined him, slipping an arm around his waist. "You're doing the right thing," Leo said softly. Julian nodded, but his eyes were on the shadows outside, searching for the SUV. The battle was far from over, and Richard's next move was coming. They just didn't know when. The first sign of Richard's escalation came in the form of a letter, delivered to Claire's workplace. It was typed and signed, but the tone was unmistakably his: cold, calculated, threatening legal action if she didn't retract the article. "You're destroying a good man's life," it read, "and dragging your daughter into your lies." Claire's hands shook as she read it. But she didn't call Richard. Instead, she called Julian, who was at the apartment helping Emily with a school project. He arrived within the hour, his face grim as he read the letter. "He's trying to scare you into silence," he said. "We don't back down." They took the letter to their lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah who specialized in family law. Sarah advised filing for a restraining order, citing the letter and Richard's recent behavior showing up at Claire's work. The investigator. The online harassment. The process was slow, but it was a start. Sarah also suggested they document everything: texts, voicemails, even the SUV sightings. He's building a case, she warned. You need to be ready for his. Emily, meanwhile, was finding her own way to cope. Julian had given her a sketchbook filled with prompts: draw your happiest memory. Draw what courage looks like. Her drawings were vivid, full of color, but some carried shadows: a faceless man in a suit, a girl hiding behind a tree. Claire watched her daughter pour her heart onto the page, and it broke her. She enrolled Emily in therapy, a gentle counselor who helped her process the wedding and its aftermath. Emily's sessions became a safe space, but she still clung to Julian, calling him her hero in a letter she wrote for school. Julian was struggling too, though he hid it well. Being back in Virginia dragged up memories he'd buried: his father's disapproval, his mother's silence, Richard's relentless need to dominate. He called Leo every night, the distance between them aching. Leo wanted to stay, but his restaurant in New York needed him. You're not alone in this, Leo said during one call, his voice steady. I'm with you, even from here. Julian held on to that, but the weight of protecting Claire and Emily was heavy. The restraining order hearing was set for a month out, but Richard didn't wait. He filed a defamation lawsuit against Claire and the magazine that published Mara's article. The news hit like a punch. The magazine stood by the story, but Claire felt the ground shift beneath her. She wasn't just fighting for her daughter now. She was fighting for her own name. Julian, furious but focused, rallied their allies. Mara connected them with a legal defense fund, and the local LGBTQ+ group organized a fundraiser to help cover costs. The community response was overwhelming, a reminder that they weren't alone. But Richard had allies too. His lawsuit drew support from his network lawyers, local business owners, even a pastor who preached about family values while ignoring Richard's actions. The town was splitting, lines drawn between those who believed Claire and those who saw Richard as the wrong party. Claire's co-workers grew distant, some out of fear, others out of doubt. Emily's school became a battleground, with parents whispering about that article and that family. Emily overheard it all, her confidence fraying. Julian decided it was time to shift the narrative. He proposed a public event, a community forum to discuss abuse, control, and healing. Claire was hesitant. Exposing their story further felt like walking into a lion's den. But Julian's conviction was unshakable. We're not just fighting Richard, he said. We're fighting what he represents: people who hurt others and call it love. Claire agreed, and they began planning with the LGBTQ+ group and a local women's shelter. The forum was held at a community center, a simple space with folding chairs and a small stage. Julian spoke first, sharing his story: not just the wedding, but his journey as a gay man in a world that often rejected him. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly, betraying the weight of it all. Claire followed, her words raw as she described the wedding, her guilt, her love for Emily. Emily didn't speak, but her presence beside them, clutching her sketchbook, said enough. The room was packed: supporters, skeptics, and curious strangers. When a man in the back heckled, calling Julian a disgrace, The crowd shut him down, their applause drowning his words. The event was a turning point. Donations poured in for the legal fund, and more people shared their stories online, tagging Richard's name. But it also painted a bigger target on their backs. Late one night, Claire found a brick thrown through her apartment window. A note tied to it, "Stop lying." She called the police, who took a report but had no leads. Julian stayed over that night, sleeping on the couch, his phone ready to dial 911. As the lawsuit loomed, Claire and Julian prepared for battle. Sarah warned them it would be ugly. Richard's lawyer was ruthless, and the case would hinge on credibility. Claire's past, Julian's identity, even Emily's drawings could be twisted against them. But they had something Richard didn't: each other. And in the quiet moments, when Emily laughed or Claire smiled, Julian saw the family they were building, fragile but fierce. The fight was far from over, but they were ready. Richard's power was crumbling, and they were the ones breaking it down. The courtroom was a sterile box, all polished wood and fluorescent lights, but it felt like a battlefield. Claire sat beside Sarah, their lawyer, her hands folded tightly in her lap as Richard's attorney painted her as an unstable mother who'd fabricated a story to ruin a good man. Richard sat across the room, his suit impeccable, his face a mask of wounded innocence. Julian, in the gallery with Emily, felt his blood boil but kept his expression neutral. Emily's small hand gripped his, her sketchbook tucked under her arm like a shield. The defamation trial had begun, and it was as brutal as Sarah had warned. Richard's lawyer, a slick man named Garrett, dissected Claire's life, her years as a single mother, her financial struggles, even a brief stint in therapy after her first husband's death. He framed it as instability, not survival. He called Julian as a witness, probing his past, his estrangement from his family, his lifestyle in New York. "Isn't it true?" Garrett asked, his voice dripping with insinuation, "that you've always resented your brother's success?" Julian's jaw tightened, but he answered calmly, "I resent his cruelty, not his success." Claire's testimony was the hardest. She recounted the wedding, her voice breaking as she described Emily's slap, the moment she realized who Richard was. Garrett cross-examined her mercilessly, twisting her words, suggesting she'd provoked Richard to protect her own ego. Claire held her ground, her eyes locked on Emily, who watched from the gallery with wide, trusting eyes. When Garrett asked why she'd stayed with Richard despite his alleged controlling behavior, Claire's answer was simple: "I wanted to believe in love. I was wrong." Emily wasn't allowed to testify her age, and the judge's ruling kept her off the stand, but her presence was felt. Julian had helped her prepare a statement, which Sarah read aloud. "I just wanted to say I love my mom," it began, "and I'm not afraid anymore because she and Uncle Julian are fighting for me." The words landed like a blow, and even Garrett faltered, his next question softer, less aggressive. The trial wasn't just about facts. It was about stories. Richard's side spun a tale of a perfect man betrayed by a vindictive woman and her troubled brother. Claire, Julian, and Sarah countered with the truth: raw, messy, human. They presented the letter Richard sent, the voicemails, the private investigators' reports. Mara testified about the article, standing by its accuracy. The LGBTQ+ group and the women's shelter sent representatives to speak about patterns of control and abuse, giving context to Richard's actions. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Outside the courtroom, the community rallied. The fundraiser had grown, drawing donations from across the country. A viral hashtag, Stand with Emily, trended online, with people sharing photos of themselves holding signs of support. Julian's speech from the community forum was clipped and shared, his words about chosen family resonating far beyond Virginia. But the attention came with a cost. Richard's supporters grew louder, their online attacks sharper. Claire's car was keyed one night, and Julian found a slashed tire on his rental. They reported each incident, building a case for the restraining order. But the fear lingered. In the evenings, they retreated to the apartment, finding solace in small rituals. Julian cooked with Emily, teaching her to make his favorite pasta dish. Claire joined them, her laughter rare but genuine. Leo flew in for a weekend, his presence a reminder of the life Julian had built beyond this fight. He and Emily bonded over a puzzle, their heads bent together, while Claire and Julian planned their next moves. "You're my family now," Claire told Julian one night, her voice quiet but sure. He nodded, too moved to speak. The trial stretched into weeks, each day a test of endurance. Richard took the stand, his charm on full display. He denied the slap, claiming Emily had misbehaved and he'd only corrected her. He painted Julian as a jealous sibling, Claire as a scorned woman. But his story cracked under Sarah's cross-examination. She played his voicemails, read the threatening letter, and presented texts he'd sent to mutual friends, revealing his rage. Richard's composure slipped, his voice rising. And for a moment, the courtroom saw the man Julian had always known. The judge called a recess, and Julian took Emily outside for air. They sat on a bench, the autumn leaves falling around them. "Are we going to win?" Emily asked, her voice small. Julian looked at her, seeing the girl who'd faced a grown man's anger and still stood tall. "We're already winning," he said, "because we're together, and we're telling the truth." Back in the courtroom, Sarah delivered their closing argument. She didn't just defend Claire. She spoke to the heart of the case. Abuse thrives in silence, and courage breaks it. The judge listened, her face unreadable. As they left for the day, Julian felt a flicker of hope, but also dread. Richard's eyes met his across the room, cold and unyielding. The verdict was coming, but so was Richard's next move. And Julian knew it would be his most dangerous yet. The verdict came on a gray November morning. The courtroom hushed as the judge read her ruling. Richard's defamation case was dismissed. Claire's story, backed by evidence and witnesses, held up. The judge's words were measured but clear. Richard's actions at the wedding, and his subsequent attempts to intimidate, painted a picture of control, not victimhood. Claire exhaled, tears spilling as she hugged Emily, who clung to her like a lifeline. Julian, sitting behind them, felt a weight lift, but his eyes stayed on Richard. His brother's face was a mask, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed his fury. The restraining order was granted the same day, barring Richard from contacting Claire or Emily. It was a victory, but it felt fragile. Richard's lawyer announced an appeal, and the crowd outside the courthouse was a mix of supporters and detractors. A woman shouted at Claire, calling her a homewrecker, while others held stand with Emily signs, their cheers drowning out the hate. Julian guided Claire and Emily through the chaos, his arm around them, a shield against the world. Back at the apartment, they celebrated quietly. Leo had flown in again, bringing ingredients for a homemade feast. They ate, laughed, and played music, Emily dancing with Julian in the tiny living room. But the joy was tempered by caution. Richard's appeal meant the fight wasn't over, and the private investigator was still out there, a shadow they couldn't shake. Julian installed more security cameras, and Claire changed her phone number. Emily, though, was blossoming, started a blog with Julian's help, sharing her sketches and thoughts about courage. It was small, but it gave her a voice, and readers responded with encouragement. The community's support grew stronger. The LGBTQ+ group invited Julian to speak at a regional conference, and Claire joined him, sharing their story to a crowd of activists and survivors. Their words sparked conversations about abuse, identity, and resilience, and the hashtag #StandWithEmily became a rallying cry. But Richard's network was relentless, spreading rumors that Claire was exploiting her daughter for attention. Julian countered online, posting about their journey, his wit and honesty cutting through the noise. Slowly, the narrative shifted in their favor. Then came the fire. It was late, 2 weeks after the verdict, when the smoke alarm blared. Claire woke to flames licking the apartment's front door, the air thick with heat. She grabbed Emily, shouting for Julian, who was sleeping on the couch. He sprang up, guiding them to the fire escape, his voice calm despite the chaos. They stumbled into the night, coughing, as firefighters battled the blaze. The apartment was gutted, their belongings reduced to ash. The fire marshal's report was inconclusive: possible arson. No proof. But Julian knew. Richard's SUV had been spotted nearby the night before, caught on a neighbor's camera. They moved to a safe house provided by the women's shelter. A small space, but secure. Claire was shaken, her resolve wavering. What if he never stops? She whispered to Julian one night, Emily asleep nearby. Julian took her hand, his voice steady. He's losing, Claire. That's why he's desperate. We keep going. For Emily. For us. She nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. The police investigated, but evidence was thin. Julian reached out to Mara, who dug into Richard's finances, uncovering payments to a shady security firm. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was leverage. Sarah used it to push for a stronger restraining order, one that included surveillance restrictions. Meanwhile, Julian and Claire planned a counterattack, not with fire, but with light. They organized a public art event, showcasing Emily's sketches alongside messages from survivors of abuse. The event, held in a local park, drew hundreds. Emily's drawings, vibrant scenes of hope and healing, stole the show, and her smile as strangers praised her work was a victory in itself. Richard's appeal loomed, but his grip was slipping. His colleagues distanced themselves. His social media posts grew erratic, and whispers of his temper spread. Julian's conference speech went viral, his call for chosen family resonating globally. Claire found a new job at a nonprofit, one that supported survivors, and enrolled in night classes to become a counselor. Emily thrived, her blog gaining followers, her voice growing stronger. But Richard wasn't done. Late one night, Julian's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You can't hide forever. He didn't show it to Claire, but he tightened security, his instincts on edge. The safe house felt like a fortress, but also a cage. They were winning, but at a cost, and Julian wondered how much more they could endure. As winter settled over Virginia, they prepared for the appeal, knowing it was their last stand. Richard's desperation was palpable, and Julian sensed he'd try something big, something to break them. But they had each other, and that was a strength Richard could never touch. The safe house was a cocoon, but it couldn't shield them from the world outside. Winter tightened its grip on Virginia, the days short and the nights endless. Claire, Julian, and Emily settled into a rhythm school for Emily, working classes for Claire, and for Julian, a constant vigil, his eyes scanning for threats. The appeal hearing was weeks away, and the tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with each passing day. Richard's text haunted Julian, a reminder that his brother played dirty. Always had. They leaned on their community to stay grounded. The women's shelter hosted weekly support groups, where Claire found solace in shared stories. Emily joined an art therapy program, her sketches now filled with bold lines and bright colors, a testament to her healing. Julian, restless, started a podcast with Mara's help, interviewing survivors and activists. His voice warm, honest, unafraid drew listeners, amplifying their fight. But every step forward came with a shadow. Richard's investigator was still out there, and strange cars lingered near the safe house, never close enough to prove anything. Then came the break-in. It was Sutlino shattered windows. No forced locks, but Claire noticed it instantly. Her laptop, where she kept notes for her classes and the case, was gone. Emily's sketchbook, left on the kitchen table, was missing pages. Julian's camera, used to document their lives for the podcast, was smashed. The police found no fingerprints, no clear evidence. But the message was clear: Richard could reach them. Even here. Claire's fear spiked, but Julian's anger burned hotter. He's trying to break us, he told Claire. But he's underestimating us. Sarah, their lawyer, moved fast. She filed a motion to expedite the appeal, citing the break-in and ongoing harassment. She also pushed for an investigation into Richard's finances, suspecting he was funding his campaign of intimidation. Mara's digging paid off. She found bank records linking Richard to the security firm, and a whistleblower from the firm came forward, admitting they'd been hired to monitor Claire's family. It wasn't enough for a criminal charge, but it strengthened their case. The judge agreed to move the appeal forward, setting a date for early January. The community rallied again, organizing a vigil in the park where Emily's art event had been. Hundreds came, holding candles against the winter chill, their breath visible in the air. Julian spoke, his words a call to action. We don't just survive, we fight. We heal. We build. Claire stood beside him, her voice softer but no less powerful, thanking the crowd for giving her daughter hope. Emily, clutching a new sketchbook, drew the scene in real time, her pencil capturing the glow of the candles, the faces of strangers who'd become allies. But Richard's next move was personal. He contacted their parents, who'd stayed silent through the ordeal, living quietly in a nearby town. Julian hadn't spoken to them in years, their rejection of his identity a wound that never fully healed. Now, Richard had convinced them to speak out, releasing a statement calling Julian a disruptive influence and Claire an unfit mother. The betrayal cut deep, but Julian didn't flinch. He wrote an open letter, shared on his podcast and social media, addressing his parents with raw honesty. You chose him over me once. I survived. Now I'm choosing Emily and Claire. And we'll survive too. The letter went viral, sparking a wave of support. People shared their own stories of family rejection, of finding chosen families who loved them as they were. The hashtag #StandWithEmily evolved into Chosen Family, a movement that spread beyond their fight. Claire, inspired, began writing her own story, a memoir of sorts, weaving her mistakes and her strength into a narrative she hoped would help others. Emily added illustrations, her art a bridge between their pain and their hope. As the appeal approached, Julian felt the weight of what was at stake. Richard's lawsuit was a long shot now, but his desperation made him unpredictable. Late one night, Julian found Emily awake, staring out the window. "What if he comes back?" she asked, her voice small. Julian knelt beside her, his heart aching. "If he does, we'll be ready," he said. "You're not just brave. Emily, you're unstoppable." She smiled, a spark of her old fire returning. The morning of the appeal, they walked into the courthouse together, a unit forged in fire. Richard was there, his eyes cold but his confidence fraying. The judge, the same one from the first trial, listened as Sarah laid out their case: Richard's harassment, the break-in, the financial trail. Garrett, Richard's lawyer, tried to spin it as coincidence, but the evidence was mounting. The courtroom felt alive, every word a step toward justice. As they waited for the ruling, Julian looked at Claire and Emily, their hands linked. They'd lost so much: their home, their safety, their innocence, but they'd gained each other. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. And that, Julian knew, was a victory Richard could never take away. The judge's gavel fell, and the appeal was denied. Richard's defamation claim crumbled under the weight of evidence: his threats, his investigator, his unraveling lies. The courtroom exhaled, a collective release of tension. Claire hugged Emily, tears streaming, while Julian sat still, his eyes on his brother. Richard's face was stone, but his hands trembled, betraying the cracks in his facade. For the first time, he looked small, a man undone by his own need for control. The judge went further, strengthening the restraining order to include a no-contact clause for Julian and a ban on Richard approaching their workplaces or school. Sarah called it a clean win, but warned them to stay vigilant. Men like Richard didn't vanish quietly. Outside, supporters cheered, their chosen family signs bright against the January snow. Emily waved shyly, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, a new drawing already taking shoppy family of 3, standing tall under a glowing sun. They moved to a new apartment, funded by the community's donations, a cozy space with big windows and room for Emily's art. Claire threw herself into her counseling classes, determined to help others rebuild as she had. Julian's podcast grew, each episode a beacon for those fighting their own battles. Emily's blog became a platform for young artists, her sketches inspiring kids across the country to share their stories. They were healing, not just from Richard, but from the weight of silence and shame. Richard faded from their lives, his reputation in tatters. Rumors swirled of lost clients. His firm sidelined him. His allies drifted away. The whistleblower's testimony had sparked an investigation into his finances, hinting at deeper troubles. Julian didn't care about his brother's downfall. He cared about the life they were building. Leo moved to Virginia, opening a small cafe near their apartment, his laughter filling their evenings. Claire started dating again, cautiously, her heart open but guarded. Emily, now 13, was thriving, her confidence a quiet fire. One spring day, they returned to the park where the vigil had been held. The oak tree from the wedding stood nearby, its branches heavy with new leaves. They spread a blanket, ate Leo's sandwiches, and watched Emily sketch the scene. Julian looked at Claire, her face soft in the sunlight, and felt a peace he hadn't known was possible. "We did it," he said, his voice low. Claire smiled, her hand finding his. "We did." The story wasn't over. Trauma lingered, and the world still held its shadows. But they'd faced the worst and come out stronger. A family forged not by blood, but by choice. Emily's latest drawing hung on their wall, a vibrant scene of 3 figures holding hands, surrounded by color and light. Below it, she'd written in her careful script, "We are enough." And they were.